is an excellent question. It was not always the plan for certain. I actually had wanted to be a fine artist when I was in school. That was my plan. I took every art class I could take. I was interested in creative writing, and I was in a creative writing club at my school, but more for poetry and that sort of thing. And then fine art was really my focus. And then I very quickly realized when I started looking at sort of university for that fine art is a really good way to not have any employment opportunities, particularly where I live. So I ended up doing an assortment of other things. I became an emergency medical technician, and I did that right out of school. And then I got into working retail and sort of was all over the place. And then I had had my middle child in 2007, and they ended up having a lot of health issues. And by 2011, I had to stop working out of the home. And I am not the sort of person who cannot be doing something. So I kind of focused my energy on writing, which is something at that point that I had been doing casually, but not with a real emphasis on it. And I was in college at the time to get my degree, which I have in psychology. So I had just started writing to have something to do, basically. And then it turns out I am reasonably good at it, apparently. So once I started and I was kind of putting my energy and my focus on that, I think I had my first self-published books were coming out right about that time. And then I had a very small children's book come out through a very, very small press that's no longer in existence, actually. And then I ended up going with Moon Books, and I have been with Moon Books ever since, which is wonderful. I love writing for Moon. So, but yeah, that's how I ended up as a writer. It was definitely not where I anticipated being, but I enjoy it. You might have assumed from my answer to the first question, writing is my full-time job at this point. So I approach it the same way that I would any other full-time career or full-time job. Generally, I write between 8 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon, which also is what works with my children's schedules with school. And I treat it the same way I would if I was working in an office job or still working retail or anything like that. And I sort of lay out what I need to get done in a particular day, sort of list my goals. I keep track of the deadlines for when specific projects are due, whether that's articles or anthology submissions or full manuscripts, and doing interviews, things like that. And I just sort of try during the day to get the work done that needs to be done for that particular day. And then it sort of every day works together. The only real difference between my regime as a writer and what I was doing when I was working a normal job, as people might say, is I do pretty much work 7 days a week. Not so much 8 to 3 on the weekends, but I'm always writing something or working on something or checking in and keeping an eye on something. There's always something going on. So that aspect is a little bit different. I probably write about 3,000 to 4,000 words a day, most days. But again, I do have the luxury of being home to do that, which many other writers don't. Most other writers are kind of doing it in their spare time around a full-time job. Whereas for me, this is my full-time job. So definitely has something to do with why I get as much done as I do. I have a lot more time to focus on it. I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I definitely aspects of my research influence my own practice, my own approach to things. It just, the nature of it, the things that I'm researching, the things that I'm studying are things that interest me, but are also things that are um, applicable or things that I, would would apply to my practice, to my daily life, if you will. On the other hand, though, there are aspects of things that are definitely, I guess I would say that I wouldn't necessarily agree with personally, but that I still study or am aware of as part of the research that I do, the information that I'm familiar with because of what I'm researching. I'm using the word research an awful lot. I apologize. But, for example, like with fairies, a lot of what I find when I'm studying them, when I'm researching the folklore and the stories, are things that I definitely keep in mind and sort of incorporate into what we would call my personal belief. But there's aspects of that, particularly the more academic side of things, where I could definitely sit here and talk for an hour about the view in academia, among folklorists about what we would call the rational explanations for fairies. The idea that Selkies are actually encounters between Celtic language speaking peoples and the Inuit, for example, or changelings as, people with behavioral or physical illnesses. That was how they were explained by those cultures. The idea of fairies in general having these rational explanations. I can talk about that. I could write about that. I have written about that actually in a couple of my books, but that doesn't mean that I necessarily personally agree with that or believe it. So that would be an area where there's definitely a difference in opinion. I do tend to see those beings as things that exist in some sense, and that have some sort of tangible reality that people can encounter and interact with and what have you. So I don't go to that extreme sort of everything has a rational explanation, scientific explanation, if you will. But I could still talk about it. I'm very familiar with it from having studied it. So it's definitely a little bit of both when it comes to that. And I'm using fairies as an example, but I could say that for any of those topics: Norse mythology, Irish mythology, fairies, any of that. So. Yes, I do write a lot for Moon Books. I just keep doing more and more. I would say probably the three that best define my work would be Fairies, A Guide to the Celtic Fair Folk. I'm particularly proud of that one. I think it covers a lot of ground and it kind of finds a balance between the more academic material and the more experiential, we'll say. Definitely Pagan Portals Aishi, which is coming out this August. It's not out yet. I think that probably is the best thing I've ever written, if I can be so bold as to say that sort of a thing. But I'm particularly proud of that one. And I think that one, out of everything I've written, really encapsulates a lot of my own personal beliefs. And, it's not written that way. It's not me writing what I believe and sharing that. It's written as more a look at the cultural Irish beliefs. But that's sort of where I'm coming from, what I'm grounded in what I believe in practice. So that book has a lot of my heart in it, I guess I would say. And definitely the new Dictionary of Fairies. Sad as it is to say that a dictionary encapsulates my personality. I think that's a good example of my approach to the subject and sort of the wide-ranging interest I have in it. And that's another one that I'm particularly proud of because it's difficult to write dictionary and encyclopedia style works. After I'd written Pagan Portals, Gods and Goddesses of Ireland, I'd actually told myself I would never do it again because they're just very difficult and tedious to put together. And then I turned around and did the New Fairies Dictionary, which was much longer and more difficult to do. So But I am proud of it. And I think that those three in particular taken together um, really sort of have a lot of my heart and my personality in them out of everything I've written. Basically, I grew up as part of the Irish American diaspora. So, my grandfather was from Ireland. We obviously are living in the US, but culturally, there's a lot of influence that you sort of grow up with in that community. And then, as well, my best friend in school when I was younger was from Ireland. She was born in Ireland and had moved here as a child. So I think for me, Ireland was just almost like the default setting. I had grown up with a lot of the stories. It was just sort of ingrained that was kind of the direction that we look in for context for particular things. And then as I got a little bit older, I started studying a selection of different cultures and topics. But Ireland was really the one that I found held the most interest for me very early on. So I started looking for books and folklore and mythology, when I was in my early teens, and kind of have just headed in that direction since. Although I do have some other interests, as we know, I've written a couple books on Norse deities, and I have the Pantheon, the Norse book coming out in a few months. So I have also studied other things. I am not completely tunnel vision in what I study and where my interests are. But I think for me, Ireland was definitely that sort of default that I've had since I was very young. So it still, to me, feels very much like home, even as again someone who grew up in the Irish American diaspora and was not clearly from Ireland. I've definitely run into that. Generally, I don't argue with people. You believe what you believe, and I am never going to convince a person that something exists if they don't believe that it exists. But my usual answer to that question, or to people making that statement, is we find fairies and we find fairy-like beings pretty much in every human culture globally. They're not called fairies in other places. Obviously, non-English speaking cultures don't use the term fairy, but it's the same concept. It's the same type of being. It's the same general description. And to me, there has to be some higher truth or some greater significance in something that is found anywhere humans are found. That just speaks to something going on that is beyond someone creating something for entertainment, or whatever other explanation you can run into for why people believe in fairies. So to me, there's always been something more significant to that idea, and so it seems hard to just dismiss it out of hand. This is probably going to surprise some people, because obviously when you ask who's a person's favorite Norse deity, there's a couple main contenders that often tend to get brought up. And it is neither one of the ones I've written books about. It actually is Heimdall, who is one of the, not more obscure necessarily, but certainly less high profile of the Norse gods. And it's hard for me to say exactly why. I've just always really liked his stories. He is the guardian of the Bifrost Bridge. He is sort of the guardian of Asgard more generally. He has like preternatural sight and hearing. So he's sort of got a little bit of that, non-Marvel superhero thing going on a bit. He has a strong connection to humanity, all types of humanity all over the place. And I just really like him when he does appear in stories, which is not as often because he is not one of the primary gods that we see being discussed. But I find him to be cool. I guess I don't know a better way to say that. But yeah, so Heimdall's my favorite. I guess just because he's awesome. Only 3. That is rough. I think my very first invitation honestly would probably go to Sir Terry Pratchett. I love his fiction. I love the way he can take on very serious topics, but he also writes with a great deal of humor. And for people who know me, particularly know me on social media, I can be very critical of the depiction of fairies in fiction. And I think that he was one of the few people out there that really had kind of dialed in how to depict the good folk, how to depict fairies in fiction in a way that was very true to the folklore, but also creative and interesting. I quote him all the time on that subject because he's just got some wonderful little snippets about elves and fairies. So definitely Sir Terry Pratchett. The second one, I would also probably go with another human who is no longer among the living, which would be my father, who passed away in 2004. Just because if I can invite anyone, I miss my dad. Why not invite my dad? And also, I would like to sort of know what he thinks about where I'm at with everything, because things are very different for me now than they were the last time I saw my dad. And then the final one, which would probably be the trickiest, but I would probably go with the Queen of Elfhame from the Scottish ballad material, because no one knows her name. No one knows who she's a lady of mystery, I'll say. No one knows who she actually is beyond the Queen of Elfhame, which is what she's often referred to. So I would love to meet her. Learn. I might be getting myself in trouble saying this, putting this energy out into the universe. But I would love to meet her and sort of find out a little more about her. And I think my opening question to all of those people that I have just invited to this very mad tea party that I'm having would be, what do you most want to tell me? And then just see what they have to say. Because I'm a big believer in letting people express themselves. And I find that often gets much more interesting conversations going than anything else. So yeah, I would just want to see what they have to say. Honestly, my top tip, which is I think the best advice I was ever given when I was first starting out writing, is to write the book you want to see. And there's a great Toni Morrison quote about that if there's a book you want to read that doesn't exist, you should write it. And that advice has honestly never steered me wrong. Everything I've written is always something, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, is always something that I feel like there isn't an example of that in the world, at least not the way that I would want to see it. And so I try to put out there what I want to read and I feel isn't out there for me to read. And I think that's the best advice for any aspiring writer, or for any writer in general, is write what you want to read, and you will definitely have an audience for it one way or another.